I am a huge Warhammer fan. I love the setting, the books, the lore, the tabletop games, and of course, the miniatures. But my first foray into the worlds of Warhammer was actually through their video games, and years later I've played nearly every one of them. So I thought it would be fun to share my personal tier list of Warhammer video games, starting with my favourite setting, Warhammer 40,000. This tier list is completely biased and based purely on my personal tastes, so you will no doubt disagree with them, and by all means, feel free to do so in the comments below. Now, there are a lot of games to get through, so let's get started. We begin with the first video game set in Games Workshop's far future, 1992's Space Crusade. This game is an absolute classic. This adaptation of the 1990 board game was the first Warhammer 40,000 video game ever made, while the franchise was still in its infancy. Players could command squads of Space Marines from the Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Imperial Fist chapters, and were tasked to clear Space Hulks of alien enemies. It's sort of odd looking back at this game, as many of its elements are unfamiliar when compared to the modern franchise, and yet a lot of it remains recognizable. While the gameplay doesn't really hold up today, I can't give it any less than a B. Mostly because of its history, that, and this iconic intro. Next we've got Space Hulk, which is based off of this absolute relic of a board game. It's actually quite similar to Space Crusade, but this time you're in control of Dark Angel's Deathwing Terminators, and the game has a weird blend of real-time strategy and first-person shooter. It's a pretty bizarre but weirdly ambitious game for the time, as you need to control each Terminator one by one, carefully positioning your units in corridors that can barely contain the Space Marine's girth, setting up firing zones to repel oncoming Gene Stealers. Going back and playing a little of the game for this video, I did appreciate the contrast between having to control your slow, cumbersome Terminators against the rapid, agile Xenos. But that slow pace and claustrophobia, paired with a very 90s difficulty curve, drags down some admittedly interesting ideas and decent atmosphere. C tier. Space Hulk sequel, Space Hulk Vengeance of the Blood Angels, builds on a lot of what made the previous game interesting, while being able to tap into the power of consoles like the original PlayStation to deliver some exceptionally cursed 3D Gene Stealers. I actually think I had this game on the PS1 back in the day, but I would have been like 5 years old, so I don't really know what my mother was thinking, or why she would buy me this. But even though it is still a bloody hard game, I can't help but look fondly on the advances in both graphics and gameplay as the Warhammer universe continued to grow within the gaming space. And it was nice to see that this game started to feature a wider variety of enemies. Even this is the third game in a row set on a space rock fighting mainly Gene Stealers. B tier. Final Liberation was based on the epic version of Warhammer 40,000, a system designed to increase the scale of battles. It included much smaller miniatures, but it meant that you could field giant Titan war machines and hundreds of troops. In 1997, Final Liberation took that system and adapted it into a video game that is best described as a turn-based 40k version of Command & Conquer. The game's campaign is actually quite deep, allowing players to choose regions to attack and unlock new units based on what regions they conquer. With it being a turn-based game, missions are once again pretty slow-paced, but it is still undeniably satisfying to field huge armies made up of dozens of tanks and artillery pieces, all rendered in crunchy 90s graphics. But what really dials up the Command & Conquer comparison is that this game actually has live-action cutscenes. They're a little corny, but personally I think it's really cool to see actors kitted out as commissars and space marines giving you orders or delivering story beats.
Choose your next words with exceptional care.
Larry Rue's performance of Commissar Holt is especially it is so good. If Henry Cavill's TV show has a commissar, this is the character that they need to take notes on. Some of the elements are 90s era CGI, but honestly, it all works really well. Even some of the orcs are shot live action, and I think this game features one of the only recorded instances of a 40k orc farting. It may have aged, but it is also my first A tier. If Final Liberation was Warhammer 40,000's answer to Command & Conquer, then 1998's Chaos Gate is their XCOM. It had a lot of the hallmarks of the genre that XCOM popularized back in the 90s, with things like action points and hit percentages, albeit with a 40k flair. You had dozens of Ultramarines at your command, from tactical marines, apothecaries, terminators, and beyond. all of which had a level of customization, allowing you to choose what weapons and equipment you took into battle. Different weaponry like flamers, plasma guns, or missile launchers all had their own unique traits and advantages, offering a decent amount of flexibility when it came to kitting out your Marines. Over the course of the campaign, your Marines could also gain experience and become more effective fighting machines. We still haven't escaped from 40k games being turn-based affairs, but even now, 1998's Chaos Gate is an easy recommend for anyone wanting a classic XCOM-style experience. B tier. 1999's Rites of War was, you guessed it, another turn-based strategy game, although we shouldn't really be too surprised, I guess, because the tabletop game is turn-based strategy, but it is the first game to feature non-Imperial protagonists. The Eldar take center stage in Rites of War's hex-based strategy, as the player commands their forces to recover a lost colony of ancient Eldar, building their army and unlocking new units as they progress. Out of all of the old-school titles that I've placed on this list so far, Rites of War is the most tedious and most difficult. And honestly, Eldar are probably one of my least favourite races in 40k, so I wasn't exactly hooked from the get-go. And the overwhelmingly garish cutscenes featuring the Eldari only make Rites of War all the more difficult to look at. D tier. 2003's Fire Warrior was the game that introduced me to Warhammer 40,000, and for that, it will always have a very special place in my heart. But all these years later, I can be honest and look back and admit, Fire Warrior wasn't very good. I definitely remember enjoying this game back when I played it as a wee lad of 12, but having replayed some of it fairly recently, playing the game after 2 decades of being a Warhammer fan is a much more conflicted experience. As a shooter, it is pretty mediocre, especially considering that Halo Combat Evolved came out 2 years earlier. To be fair though, it is the first game on this list that isn't a strategy title. Fire Warrior is a first-person shooter where you play as a Tau Fire Warrior named Shaslar Case during his first ever mission. Bear that in mind because during the 24 hours surrounding the first mission, Case is able to kill hundreds of Imperial Guard, several Space Marines, even more Chaos Space Marines, Chaos Obliterators, and a bloody Tzeentch Lord of Change, a Greater Demon. That would make Case one of the most powerful mortal entities in all of 40k, and he's done this all in under 24 hours on his first day. The Tau are meant to be one of the most technologically advanced races in 40k, with their weaponry being some of the most powerful. Yet in Fire Warrior, you're almost always on the hunt for the more plentiful Imperial weaponry. A lot of the major story beats are pretty Imperium-centric too, which really takes the spotlight away from what was supposed to be the Tau main character. Looking back, the best part of this game is that it had the sickest box art, and it was the first game to have its own promotional miniature. It is a pretty flawed game, especially by today's standards. It probably deserves lower, but because it was my introduction to the franchise, personally, I can't give it any lower than a C. Alright, now we are getting to the cream of the 40k video game crop, as 2004 blessed us with the iconic Dawn of War. Watching that intro cinematic still gives me goosebumps. Dawn of War was not only a great 40k game, it's a great RTS game in general. Dawn of War has some extremely memorable moments and characters and was one of the first games to really humanize the Space Marines and showcase their relationship with not only lesser troops, but with other races and factions. The story was even strong enough that Relic was able to introduce their own chapter of Space Marines into the 40k canon, the Blood Ravens. It was an immensely satisfying RTS game as well. The ability to customize the loadout of your Space Marines meant that you could adapt to the enemy you were fighting, and building up your base and armored units, zooming into troops to watch sync kills, or just smashing into enemies from above using the jump packs of your Assault Marines was always a gratifying spectacle. Unlike other RTS titles of the time, where the gameplay required the management of gatherers and resource nodes, basically every unit in each faction's roster was there to fight. This meant the Dawn of War experience was much more action-packed than most other RTS games. If you wanted more resources, you had to kill and conquer for them. It doesn't get more grimdark than that. Dawn of War is virtual 40k at its best. It never aimed to recreate the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop experience. Instead, it used the setting to bring the universe to life within gameplay that both Warhammer fans and beyond fell in love with. While not my favourite Dawn of War game, it can't go any lower than S tier. The expansions that followed were also great within their own rights as well. Winter Assault fleshed out the Imperial Guard as their own playable faction with their own campaign and gameplay. Dark Crusade introduced the Tau and Necrons, as well as a broader battle map that saw factions battling for persistent sectors. This was something that was tweaked in Soulstorm's campaign, but that package came with playable Sisters of Battle, Dark Eldar, and introduced flying units. Each expansion easily deserves a spot in the A tier. By 2006, 2 Warhammer games had released on the NGAGE, which for you younger audiences was Nokia's attempt to combine a handheld gaming device with a phone. I never played these games, so we'll skip over them. And as we continue the list, if I've not played something, it will go in the unplayed tier. We are still going to be talking about the vast majority of video games, and for sure all of the big hitters. But if for some reason you are the world's biggest, Squad Command on PSP fan, or really love Freeblade on iOS, I can only apologize. I understand that to some this is a controversial opinion, but personally, I liked Dawn of War 2 more than I did the original. Dawn of War 2 was a big switch up from the previous game. It removed a lot of the base building and instead focused the gameplay on squad-based combat, abilities, and the use of cover. To me, it just felt a bit tighter, and being able to fight through whole skirmishes with relatively few numbers of elite troops just felt more satisfying. Squad-based abilities meant well-placed heavy bolter teams could pin and suppress enemies, well-flung grenades could clear out entrenched units, and enemy heavy weapons could be countered with visceral use of jump packs and chainswords. To me, having a smaller number of Space Marines made them feel all the more powerful, and having the ability to upgrade each squad's stats and equip them with unique war gear allowed you to more finely tweak your fighting force. And this made the story feel tighter, the characters more fleshed out, and offered more in the way of player choice. This was only further enhanced with the Chaos Rising DLC, which continued the story but allowed you to go down the path of heresy, depending on what choices you made in the wider battle map or what demonic weaponry you equipped. The following Retribution DLC brought with it the fantastic Last Stand game mode, where players would control hero units and cooperate with other players against endless waves of Tyranids. But it also brought with it several new factions that you could control through their own campaigns, one of them being the freebooter Orc Pirate Captain Bloodflag. That alone secures Dawn of War 2 a spot on this list, and the game remains as one of my favourite Warhammer 40,000 video games. Dawn of War 2 and its DLCs get put in the S tier. I had completely forgot that I had even played this game Kill Team back when it released in 2011. It was a frantic twin-stick shooter where you controlled a singular Space Marine, picking from either a Stern Guard or Vanguard veteran, a Tech Marine, or a Librarian. It was pretty basic, pretty short, but I do remember it being a lot of fun, especially when played in 4-player co-op. It wasn't the best game, but being able to play a short, simple, action-packed, grimdark arcade experience for less than a tenner was money well spent for 2011's Dave. B tier. What can I say about 2011 Space Marine that hasn't already been said? You know where I'm putting this game on the list. This was the first game to really make you feel like a Space Marine. You can feel the mass and intensity behind every weighty strike, every shot, every heavy step forward. There was a satisfying blend between the ranged and melee combat, which would change depending on the enemies you're facing and the weapons available. It allowed you to feel as invincible as a Space Marine should, while the intense melee combat worked to keep you on your toes. Healing is primarily delivered by executing brutal finishing moves on the enemy, which meant you were not only rewarded for being where the combat was thickest, it was almost essential. There's not much more grimdark than healing back to full health by chainswording an orc in two. In 2011, we were well and truly in the era of cover shooters, but Space Marine let you be the cover. Even back then, I could tell that the game was crafted by people who really cared deeply about the franchise. The story rivals some of the Black Library books I've read, and all the details from how the Ultramarines communicate with each other to the awe that regular humans look upon them with are all spot on. And while its multiplayer wasn't the most balanced experience in the world, it was fun and satisfying enough that fans have been begging for any Space Marine 2 multiplayer details. Space Marine is the 40k video game I think about whenever this subject pops up. It's loved by so many Warhammer fans, and I think it's fair to say it had a crossover appeal with wider gaming audiences. A lot of the excitement people have for the upcoming Space Marine 2 comes from the foundation built from the original Space Marine back in 2011. I loved it then, and I love it now. I actually wrote a test review for the game back in 2012, 2013 when I was trying to get into games media, and one of the pieces of feedback was that it was way too long. So even back then, I found it hard to contain my enthusiasm for this game. S tier. Now, 2013 Space Hulk was simply a video game adaptation of the tabletop game. It was slow, it was basic, but did exactly what it said on the tin. There wasn't really much to write home about then, and there honestly isn't much to say about it now. The tabletop version was and always will be more entertaining than this 2013 release. D tier. I know a lot of people that really like 2014's Armageddon, but for one reason or another, this hex-based RTS never really stuck with me. While pretty basic on the surface, Armageddon does have an impressive amount of depth and an incredible amount of unit variety. That variety means there is tons of potential when it comes to how units interact on the battlefield, meaning talented virtual generals will likely have a blast making sure the right weapons are being used for the right job. For 40k nerds that want a slower, deeper tactical experience, I'm not surprised so many have enjoyed Armageddon, but for me, I'm putting it in the C tier. Storm of Vengeance was sort of like 40k Plants vs Zombies, but instead of pea shooters being rooted into the ground, each of your units was a Space Marine or something similar that would march forward in a straight line. It was a pretty bizarre Warhammer tower defense game, but I could never figure out who the game was supposed to be for. The Warhammer-ness of it really just felt like a skin on top of a different game. It wasn't well received then, and I don't think anyone misses it now. E tier. Space Hulk Ascension was the follow-up to the previously mentioned Space Hulk from 2013. In many ways, it did ascend from the previous title, as it was basically improved in every way possible. It was less tied to its tabletop roots, but still retained the soul of Space Hulk. It had a few visual improvements, but more importantly, it played much more like its own game than a straight tabletop recreation, adding new mechanics, progression, and gameplay options. But, for me, it can only ascend as high as a C. Warhammer 40,000 Regicide was a bizarre combination of 40k and chess. No, really, it's basically a chess set with Space Marines and Orcs as the pieces. The Regicide mode did change up the rules somewhat, allowing pieces to sort of chip away at each other with ranged attacks and special abilities, or insta-kill an opposing piece by taking them with a traditional chess-style move. The best thing about this game, though, was that each of the units had some pretty impressive execution animations for when one piece took another. Like many other games on this list, Regicide is unfortunately no longer available. But if you like chess and like 40k, you would have probably liked this game. For now, it settles on the C tier. Did you ever read those choose-your-own-adventure books where something would happen, you'd flick to a certain page to see what happens next, and you would cheat and go back because you didn't like the outcome? That's what Legacy of Dorn, Herald of Oblivion is. It's a 40k virtual choose-your-own-adventure. It is interesting that Steam sells a 40k adventure novel like this, but if you wanted to read through a Warhammer short story with a few branching paths, hey, it's there for you. It does have a very basic turn-based combat system, but it is much more book than it is game. And if you fancied reading some 40k fiction, I'd much sooner recommend Eisenhorn, Cephas Cain, or Storm of Iron. D tier. And speaking of Eisenhorn, while the character appears in some of the best 40k novels, they are also unfortunately front and center in one of the worst 40k games. Eisenhorn Xenos, based off of the Xenos novel, was ugly. Its combat was clunky and frustrating, and felt as though it just struggled to glue together the story beats it lifted from the book. Weirdly, Mark Strong voiced the main character Eisenhorn years after he starred in Space Marine, and he is by far one of the few highlights of this game. It really was a shame that one of 40k's most iconic characters found themselves in such a poor video game. Unfortunately, it's E tier. When Battlefleet Gothic Armada released in 2016, players were finally able to command the colossal spacefaring vessels of 40k in ship-to-ship combat. The game was based on the 1999 tabletop game Battlefleet Gothic, and there was a lot of excitement around the 2016 video game release. Despite being set in space, combat plays like old seafaring galleons, but there was a decent amount of strategy to be found in positioning your ships for an effective broadside or lining up for a savage ram. There was a serviceable campaign, and each faction had their own unique playstyles. For example, Eldar ships relied on fast movement and agility, while Space Marine vessels weathered enemy fire to launch boarding actions to kill enemy crew. Unfortunately, there was also some extremely unbalanced AI. as well as some extremely frustrating micromanagement. The game was slow-paced enough that meant it took a while to get into combat. And then if you ended up with a damaged ship due to imbalance or awkward micro, it felt all the more irritating to have to restart a mission. Thankfully, its successor, that we'll talk about later, offers a much tighter and more satisfying spacefaring experience. But 2016's Battlefleet Gothic Armada gets put in C tier. Next, I want to talk about one of the biggest disappointments in all of Warhammer 40,000 games, and that is what happened to Eternal Crusade. While the game never saw full release, myself and many others fell in love with it during its early access. It was a blend of two things I really love, and that is 2011 Space Marine and the Battlefield franchise. The core gameplay was very similar to Space Marine's multiplayer, but the battles were much bigger and now included vehicles, different factions like Orcs and Eldar, which all came together to basically just scale up the entire experience. It was immensely satisfying attacking objectives with Predator tanks while enemy Chaos Marines defended with heavy weapons, or flanking said heretics from the sky using jump packs to close in and strike them down with chainswords and power fists. However, development was fairly slow. In fact, the gameplay that I loved wasn't the original goal of the game at all. Instead, it was meant to be more of an MMO FPS experience similar to PlanetSide 2. The last playable version of the game was a buggy, unbalanced mess, which is all the more unfortunate that this was the last taste many players got before the servers were ultimately shut down. I do hope that this game, or one like it, makes a comeback, because more so than any others, this was a game that absolutely oozed potential. But for now, it stays in C tier. And just as quickly as we left, we are back in the dang Space Hulk again. This time though, it's a Left 4 Dead-esque co-op first-person shooter experience, with you playing as a member of the Dark Angels Deathwing, fighting their way through a Space Hulk. At launch, it had a plethora of issues, including poor optimization, terrible AI, and a host of bugs. And I don't mean the Tyranid kind. The gameplay was a bit of a confusing mess too. Despite stomping around in Terminator armor, you were too squishy and dealt too little damage to get anywhere close to the power fantasy of being a heavily armed and armored super soldier stomping through a Space Hulk. It's a shame because the design and aesthetic in every other aspect is pretty great. Once again, you can tell that people who really care about the world and franchise built these models and arenas, but frustrating gameplay means this impressive Space Hulk is just not a fun place to be in. 2016's Deathwing is a D tier game. Although Deathwing did receive an upgraded Enhanced Edition 2 years later, unfortunately for as many issues it fixed, just as many remained present. It can be a fun experience with friends if you're able to overlook some of the issues, but the fact of the matter is, even the Enhanced Edition is C tier at most. Not even my love for my beautiful forest green Marines could save Deathwing. Now we get to the other big disappointment in 40k games, and that is the difficult third child of Dawn of War 3. I was extremely excited for Dawn of War 3 ever since I saw that amazing 2016 trailer. However, for myself and the community at large, that excitement became short-lived. It felt like it tried to take the large battles and base building from the first Dawn of War and mix them with the focus on heroes and abilities from Dawn of War 2. It was a gorgeous game to look at, but unfortunately this amalgamation of features resulted in the gameplay being an awkward, clashing mess. It often felt extremely awkward to try and effectively manage your heroes and the abilities of your troops, leading you to rely on basic massed troops and default attacks, and feel as though you're stuck experiencing half of what the game had to offer. The multiplayer skirmishes would play like a strange MOBA where you push down one lane of the map only to find the enemy on the other side with no satisfying way to respond. Units and faction abilities were also pretty unbalanced, so it was common for a large AoE to take out most of your forces and then have the enemy steamrolling your base before you could even think about defending or responding. It is a shame that this is the last we saw of a series that really did help elevate Warhammer 40,000 and introduce so many to the franchise. Relic really did some fantastic work with 40k, but Dawn of War 3 can't get more than a D. Also, did anyone find out who thought a front-flipping Gabriel Angelos in Terminator armor was a good idea? Not me. Sanctus Reach is an interesting entry, and by no means is it a bad game. I wouldn't exactly call it good either. It is another turn-based strategy title, but compared to a lot of others on the list, it never stood out to me. I mean, I collect Dark Angels, so maybe it's because this game focuses around the Space Wolves. I know there are plenty of folks out there that really do enjoy Sanctus Reach and say it's a decent virtual representation of the tabletop experience. Although it is a solid C for me. Not great, but not bad either. 2018's Inquisitor Martyr asked the question, what if we took Diablo and put it into 40k? That's the main pitch, and the resulting game is a fairly intense action RPG where you take the role of an inquisitorial band exploring a sector of space, clearing out heresies as you go. It had a decent amount of variety in classes, abilities, and the equipment you could use, and even more has been added over the years with a decent amount of DLC. The missions did get somewhat repetitive after a while, but honestly I enjoyed my time with Inquisitor Martyr more so than I did the recent Diablo 4. So for that, I'm putting it in B. Okay, so we've had Left 4 Dead 40k, we've had XCOM 40k, Diablo 40k. What about Sid Meier's Civilization, but 40k? But with much more focus on the war and conquering element. The city building and troop maneuvering will be familiar to anyone who has played the Civilization series, but it's expanded upon with the use of hero units. Heroes can gain experience, level up, unlock new abilities, and equip items, all of which comes together to create a nice little RPG side dish to the grand strategy main course. I will admit I did find the game a little overwhelming and a little slow when it first released in 2018, but having revisited the title a couple of times after a few DLCs and updates, I found myself really enjoying my time with Gladius Relics of War. For a fan of 40k or the Civilization games, there's plenty to sink your teeth into here. B tier. Alright, you know what time it is. It's time for another Space Hulk game, yay! To be fair to Space Hulk Tactics though, it is definitely one of the stronger titles to be set within one of these floating hunks of rock and debris. But does that mean it's necessarily good? It is easily the best looking of the bunch and added a few features to elevate the gameplay of the tabletop. Namely, it introduced a card system that players could use for buffs or convert to action points, allowing the game to feel a little more flexible and dynamic. It also allowed you to play as the Gene Stealers if you wanted a different Space Hulk experience. Personally though, I still found it to be a little too slow for my tastes. I'm starting to think that I may just not like Space Hulk, but I can admit that if you wanted a virtual Space Hulk experience, this would be the one I'd recommend. C tier. We've had a lot of XCOM style games appear on the list, but Mechanicus is easily one of the best. Instead of relying on something as basic as cover, the game instead revolves around the use of your expendable meat shields like servitors or Scutari, with them taking the brunt of Necron fire while your more valuable tech priests investigate the tombs. You can use these tech priests to scan surroundings, investigate anomalies, or poke around inside Necron corpses. Any action that could, in theory, further your scientific inquiries rewards cognition points that can then be spent on extra movement or devastating attacks. This system means that clever use of your troops can quickly turn into your units snowballing into victory and scientific enlightenment provided you command them well. Outside of battles, each deployment plays out kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure, allowing the player to explore different rooms, solve puzzles, or investigate artifacts. Within those, there is a selection of options to choose from, with the results varying from advantageous to devastating. It did take me a little while to get my head around the system, and even then I found it was pretty easy to get into a negative feedback loop and become overrun with Necrons. Although the Adeptus Mechanicus faction hasn't really had much of a spotlight in 40k games, but this game nails their vibe perfectly. It also has a fantastic soundtrack, so I'm putting Mechanicus in the A tier. We are back with Battlefleet Gothic, but the 2019 sequel to the 2016 release is much improved. Its opening minutes also allow you to play through a portion of one of the most pivotal moments in the 40k canon, as you watch Abaddon the Despoiler crash a giant space fortress into the planet Cadia, cracking it in half. When I first saw that, I thought, wow, Battlefleet Gothic is not playing around this time. There have been some obvious improvements and adjustments to a lot of the issues that surrounded the previous title, but the core of the game remains much the same, although rather less frustrating. There are still some issues with the gameplay, chief among them, frustrating AI enemies, but it is much easier to appreciate how cool it is to fly through the void waging war in a giant space cathedral this time round. The number of playable campaigns and factions has also been expanded upon, and while I am no fan of Xenos, I can't help but appreciate being able to latch onto enemy ships with gargantuan tentacles while playing as the Tyranids. B tier. Necromunda is a setting within 40k that embraces more of the creative and bizarre elements of the franchise, mainly focusing on the heavily stylized gangs waging war in the underbelly of the hive city of Necromunda. So when Underhive Wars was announced, I was excited to see a video game take on Necromunda. It's another turn-based tactical game similar to XCOM, but the main thing that sets it apart is its verticality and movement gameplay. Because Necromunda is set within a hive city, a lot of the fighting takes place on gangways or balconies within huge factories. In Underhive Wars, players are able to move their units freely, with plenty of options to traverse up ziplines to gain height advantage or rappel down to seek cover or flank. Unfortunately, this feature seems to baffle the AI on release, with enemy units often getting stuck or seemingly walking to nowhere in particular, frustratingly drawing out fights. Aesthetically, the game looks great, it has a really unique style, but that isn't enough to elevate what is an interesting but pretty tedious strategy game. C tier. Warhammer 40,000 Battlesector was the first game to bring the worlds of 40k into virtual reality. While it is extremely cool to feel that immersed in the 40k setting, seeing a bolt gun in your hand or having to look up at a Space Marine, Battlesector was unfortunately a basic and rather frustrating shooter. Weapon interactions were both basic and clumsy, meaning it was common for me to drop a weapon on the ground while trying to holster it as an enemy charged me, and then not notice for a good few minutes until I ended up haplessly pouring at an empty weapon slot. Firearms lacked punch, and the melee boiled down to haphazardly flailing. Although it was at least an interesting experience, and I would love to see more VR titles explore 40k. Battlesector left me frequently motion sick, I busted my hand on my dining table during melee combat, but despite all that, there was enough there to see me through finishing the game. C tier. Our second virtual visit to Necromunda offers a much more satisfying experience, even if it does sort of clumsily blend together a bunch of FPS buzzwords. A looter shooter mixed with a movement shooter with just a few sprinklings of RPG. It is without a doubt emulating the gameplay of the more recent Doom titles, from the frenetic action, weapon switching, and even the soundtrack. Although no other 40k game offered the ability to wall run, dash, slide, double jump, and swing from grappling hooks while throwing grenades and firing a plasma gun. But Necromunda is probably the only place in which this kind of gameplay makes a lick of sense. The looting is odd and does feel somewhat out of place. As you progress through a level, you may find a weapon that is a higher rarity or does a little more damage than your current loadout. This means there will be some moments where your pistol will do more damage than your bolter. Not a huge deal, but definitely a head scratcher if you're a 40k fan. For the most part though, Hired Gun is an entertaining, energetic FPS experience, and there really isn't anything else like it in 40k. Taking into account all of the 40k games today, I would call this the franchise's third best shooter. But it is an easy B. For everything that I felt Sanctus Reach lacked, Battlesector provides. Not to sound too harsh, but personally I see no reason to play Sanctus Reach while Battlesector exists. Because you're commanding multiple groups of units rather than individuals, it has a much wider sense of scale, and a wider faction roster, each with their own gameplay mechanic that vastly increases variety and replayability. The environment, models, and weapon effects also make Battlesector's gameplay feel much more immersive than many of the other turn-based strategy titles on this list. But like many other games, gameplay can somewhat slow to a crawl at times, but most frustrating for me is that the single-player experience is fairly lacking, and I lack both the IQ points and tactical acumen to really succeed in multiplayer. But it is still an extremely solid strategy game, and an easy B. Out of all of the XCOM likes that 40k has dabbled in, Chaos Gate Daemonhunters is the one that is most like XCOM. It took 24 years to get a reboot of the 1998 Chaos Gate, but this time you're commanding a squad of Grey Knights against the forces of Nurgle. As I said, this game is the most like 2016's XCOM, with elements like varying cover, Overwatch, and similar threat meters and research systems that can be found between missions. The thing that sets it apart the most, however, are the weapons and abilities of your Grey Knights. There is much more emphasis on melee combat, with classes being able to teleport and dash into melee distance and plunge powered swords and halberds into the enemy. Then there are the psychic powers, which offer an extra tactical layer, as the use of these powerful abilities also raises your warp surge meter, which can cause debuffs or spawn enemies if not properly managed. Again, similarly to XCOM, your Grey Knights can be upgraded, equipped with new weapons, and their losses will be keenly felt if one should fall in battle, only for them to be replaced with a fresh recruit. There is a lot to like about Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, but it really lacks variety. Throughout the entire campaign, you'll largely be fighting the same enemies every mission, and each one takes up just enough time that during the later levels, I found myself wanting to avoid anything other than the main story missions. I really wish this game was expanded on further beyond the 2 DLCs it received, but as it stands, I'm putting it in B tier. We got to the 34th game in the list before we talked about a mobile game. Warhammer 40,000 has had a few mobile titles over the years, but Tacticus is the only one I've spent a decent time with. Firstly, it's free, but it does have a lot of microtransactions. But from what I've played, I've been able to get plenty of enjoyment out of Tacticus without rinsing my credit card. It's a pretty basic turn-based strategy game, but for being a mobile title, there is a surprising amount of different units and abilities. There are multiple campaigns, each with their own challenges and secondary objectives, as well as a pretty entertaining multiplayer skirmish mode, as well as timed raids for folks playing within a guild, all offering a selection of rewards that can be used to upgrade your units or earn packs that can unlock new characters. But I have 2 main gripes. The first being that progression really plateaus after a while, and secondly, unlocking new units and upgrading them is a long process and often involves repeating the same missions again and again. With all that aside though, it's a fun little game to play while on the bus or if you're waiting for your shade paints to dry. B tier. Very few games get to really explore the charming absurdity of the orcs. Shooter's Blood and Teeth does so within the realms of a bizarre side-scrolling shooter, developed by the team behind Guns, Gore and Cannoli. It is more than likely that you've played multiple games similar to this, but you can tell the Orky 40k layer was applied with love and care. The game is definitely best experienced in the chaos of 4-player co-op, and the image of a cartoon orc or 4 squaring off against a giant Imperial Knight is again very charming. You can complete the game in somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, and there is unfortunately very little in the way of replayability. But it will be a laugh if you can get 3 other friends on board, and while it did bring a smile to my face, it does sit in the C tier. Darktide is another 40k game that I was absolutely chomping at the bit for when it was announced, and while great, it has had its share of issues. Firstly, Fat Shark has absolutely nailed the feeling of 40k in Darktide. The environments and aesthetics are perfect. It has a really impressive level of scale and authenticity. The hive cities and hab blocks feel massive and daunting, while also feeling both bizarre and strangely familiar. All of this plays host to hordes of heretics and demons for you to blow apart or cleave into, which creates one of the most immersive 40k experiences available. There is also an impressive amount of depth to be found in the combat mechanics. If you don't care about metas, each and every weapon is fun to use at lower to moderate difficulties, but there are also gear ratings, stats, and modifiers to play with if you're someone that does like to min-max their build. Variety in weapons and classes also offer a decently diverse number of playstyles, from tanky Ogryns, sharpshooting veterans, melee-focused zealots, or warp-wielding psykers. Darktide also features some of the most satisfying implementations of bolters and chainswords. My 2 main issues with the game though are its story and its live service element. The story was written by Dan Abnett, one of the best when it comes to 40k fiction. But beyond the admittedly great setting, there is very little story to be found. I hope we get to see more of it as content comes to the game via its live service, something that seems to have been slowed somewhat by the game's earlier launch issues. But aside from that, in 2024, Darktide offers one of the most polished and satisfying 40k experiences, and one that absolutely nails the Left 4 Dead in 40k goal that Deathwing was chasing years ago. A tier. Boltgun's throwback to classic FPS titles showed that you can make a great game in the grimdark universe of the 41st millennium without taking yourself too seriously. On the surface, and even on the game's cover, Boltgun is 1993's Doom wearing a bloodied 40k coat, but that classic Doom formula has been tweaked to the point where the game also feels accessible to a more modern audience, without losing any retro flair. There are plenty of moments in 40k lore where a Space Marine is depicted as being weighty, large and imposing, while also having incredible speed and agility. Boltgun encapsulates that description perfectly as you dash from cover to cover or close the gap to rend cultists with your chainsword. There is plenty of weapon variety too, from bolters and melters to Volkite weapons and plasma guns. And each weapon has its own advantages, so you'll find yourself rapidly swapping between them during intense arena combat, further driving up the intensity of battle. This is another game that really nails the setting. Enemies are well realized and would be instantly recognizable to any 40k fan, And while the story is fairly simple, there are nice nods to 2011 Space Marine that helps flesh out the story. The worst thing I could say about Boltgun is it does start to feel somewhat repetitive with overly long levels, the same bullet sponge enemies appearing toward the latter third of the game, and a few awkward platforming sections. But this is another easy recommendation for any fan of boomer shooters or Warhammer 40,000. A tier. In terms of world, story and setting, Rogue Trader is one of my favourite 40k games, but a few sticking points meant that love didn't always come easy. A big CRPG in the 41st millennium is a game I have wanted for years. Alcat's Rogue Trader is just that. In 40k, a Rogue Trader is a high-ranking Imperial servant tasked with exploring the far reaches of the galaxy to bring worlds into Imperial control. To do this, you are provided with a warrant of trade, which is basically a letter from the Emperor himself entitling you to pretty much do whatever you want. This freedom means you are able to take your gargantuan ship, build your retinue with whatever loyalist or heretical individuals you deem fit, and go places and use technology that would otherwise see an individual executed. It was an incredible feeling being able to build my character and explore this portion of 40k with so much choice at my disposal. And whether you want to play as a dogmatic commissar who is quick to draw on any individual uttering heretical thought, a psyker tempted by the power of the warp, or somewhere in between, Rogue Trader provides plenty of opportunity to lean into whatever grimdark character you want to play as. Where it struggles though is progressing your character and building up their abilities. There are so many passive and active abilities, too many I'd say, and many will come with a large, confusing description to the point that in the late game, I had a few abilities that I either never used or just didn't know what they did. The final acts are also noticeably rougher and thinner than the rest of the game. While I was really engaged with the story, the exploration and freedom that really makes this game great is somewhat lacking in the latter hours. But while it has a few issues, I really love Rogue Trader. To a 40k fan, I think it's a must play, and would even recommend it to anyone who just wants to get lost in a unique CRPG. A tier. Oof, okay, I have now talked about just under 40k games. I almost wish I went back and played 2 more to make that neater, but that's the list. Let me know what you thought about my tier list and how you would rank these games in the comment section below. I, for one, am extremely excited to see where Space Marine 2 ends up on this list. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go and try and make a dent in my pile of grey back there, but I will see you in the next one.